Professor John Quigley, welcome to our interview. Professor John Quigley is a prominent international law expert and jurist. He has written extensively on different topics, multiple issues in international law, including the issue of Palestine. He taught in different universities in different countries. He masters many languages besides his mother tongue English, including Spanish, French, Swahili and Russian, I believe. It's quite humbling to be interviewing you, sir, here. Thank you so much for your time. Before we start learning from your experience and from your knowledge in international law, we would like to have a deeper insight on Professor John Quigley and what brought him to the field of law, international law. International law is a very controversial and very complicated area and subject. What brought you here?
Mm-hmm. I first became interested in international law during the time of confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I was hopeful that international law could be used somehow to overcome the differences and the conflict between the two major powers and perhaps to avoid a world war. At that time, we were worried about nuclear war between the two countries.
Quite interesting. Okay, now about Palestine. You have written about so many topics in international law, including the nuclear issue of the Soviets. But Palestine seems to be a very complicated issue. Like, is this the reason you came to Palestine, or what was the reason that you were interested in this topic?
Well, I became interested in the Palestine issue because I saw that there were violations of international law being committed. This was the period of the 1970s when I first became involved in the question. And at the time, there were very few scholars that were focusing on the Palestine question from the standpoint of international law, from the standpoint of the rights of the Palestinian people to self-determination, from the question of human rights and violations of their human rights. These issues were not being discussed in the legal literature to a great extent, at least in the West, in the English language. So I thought that there needed to be more focus.
I have asked you this in person, and I would like to ask it again for the record and to have deeper insight on this. Your opinions are not really so much in line with the current discourse in the US. It's somehow like you're swimming against the current in your opinions, which made you popular in some different part of the world, but maybe, I don't know how your ideas were received within the legal academia in the US. And did you undergo any difficulty because of these opinions?
Well, I think my ideas are received better outside the United States than they are received inside the United States. But over time, the opinion has changed in the legal academy in the United States. In the 1960s and 70s, the opinion was strongly in favor of Israel's position, in particular in connection with the war of 1967. But then in the 1990s and more recently, there's been a significant shift in opinion, brought about in part, I think, by the Intifada that occurred in Palestine, and other factors, so that nowadays what I write is accepted much better than it was 30 years ago.
Now about the issue itself, like Israel was established after a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, as scholars like Ilan Pape would call it. Does this ethnic cleansing that has been recognized by some historians, or the neo-historians, let's say, as they call them within the Israeli academia. Does this make Israel less of a state legally? And if that has no influence on the legality of Israel, like the way it was established, doesn't this give some sort of encouragement for other groups to pursue the same means and employ the excessive use of force and atrocities to establish their own state, like ISIS did, for example, in Syria and Iraq, from a legal point of view?
Yes, yeah, that's a serious issue. When Israel established itself, it tried to gain acceptance from the international community, in particular to become a member of the United Nations. And it confronted an obstacle there because it had to prove that it was a peace-loving country, and it had just ethnically cleansed the population of the country over which it was claiming sovereignty. And it was questioned very seriously about this at the General Assembly, but was nonetheless admitted as a member state, which may seem very strange, and which does promote the phenomenon that you suggest, that it indicates that if an entity can establish itself as a state, even by committing atrocities against the population, that is sufficient. In general, in international law, statehood depends on acceptance by the international community. And if the international community accepts a state that is committing atrocities, then it is accepted, which may not be the ideal system, and others have suggested that there should be some kind of criteria for a state that are more rigorous. I mean, in principle, there is the principle that the membership in the United Nations is dependent on the state being peace-loving. But often political considerations come into play. Israel was questioned very seriously about the ethnic cleansing at the time that it filed its application for membership in the United Nations. And it was questioned very seriously about its intentions with regard to Jerusalem. Those were the two major issues on which Mr. Abba Eban, as the representative, was questioned in the ad hoc political committee of the General Assembly in May of 1949. But in the final analysis, becoming a state depends on what is accepted by the international community. That's why Palestine is a state now, because Palestine is accepted by the international community.
So it's more about recognition than the criteria of peace-loving.
Yes, I wouldn't use the term recognition because that's a technical term that applies to a state wanting to establish diplomatic relations. You can often have states that lack diplomatic relations with another state. You would say they have not given it formal recognition, yet they accept the fact that the entity is a state.
Are Palestinians entitled to claim reparations from Israel because of the crimes that have been committed and inflicted upon them? And from Great Britain or United Kingdom, the successor of Great Britain, for facilitating the establishment of Israel and facilitating the, maybe indirectly, but campaign of ethnic cleansing that happened. It wouldn't have happened. Palestinians, some reports say that Palestinians were disarmed, systematically disarmed before the war started. So what do you think?
Well, there is, I think, a basis for reparations. I think what the Palestinian people have claimed more is restitution in kind, what we call restitutio in integrum, meaning a restoring of the previous situation, in particular return, which is different from reparations. If you use reparations in the narrow sense of financial compensation. Although the term reparations is in international law used more broadly to include any kind of remedy. If you look at the draft articles on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts, the term reparation is a very broad term, and then financial compensation is one aspect that is used when one cannot restore the rights of the injured party to what they were previously. But certainly financial compensation is owing, but it's from the political standpoint, it's a bit difficult. Israel has always been willing to pay compensation to the Palestinians if they would go away and stop bothering them. And then, of course, Israel would get money from the United States, and so Israel would be very happy. So in that sense, financial compensation is something that has not been pressed on the Palestinian side, because the more serious remedy that is sought is restitutio in integrum.
As for the United Kingdom?
And as for the United Kingdom, yes, the United Kingdom can't restore in kind, so financial compensation would be the only possibility. But the role is a bit more attenuated. I mean, it was Israel that actually drove the Palestinians out. The British government's policy was one that had the consequence that occurred, but it wasn't Britain that did it directly. There is in the law of state responsibility the notion of complicity, and fostering a situation that leads to harm. And I think in that sense there could be made a reasonable case against Britain for bringing a population into Palestine that then would engage in ethnic cleansing. And the fact of that role on the part of Britain is made clear because the British government in the 1920s understood that what it was doing was going to lead to the kind of difficulties that then occurred upon the withdrawal of Britain from Palestine. In particular, the British government in the year 1923 engaged in a reconsideration of the Balfour Declaration. In 1923, there was a change in government in Britain, and the new government decided to have a review of the Balfour Declaration and the policy of the previous government. It did this confidentially. It did not do this in public. But if you look at the records were made public. The documents were classified at the time, but then they were declassified many years later. And they make clear that the British government understood as of 1923 that bringing a population of Jews from Europe into Palestine with the idea that those migrants were going to try to take over the country, that this would lead to nothing good, and that the rights of the population of Palestine would be overridden. But Britain decided, for reasons of its own policy, that it didn't want to say that in public. So it continued to tell the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations that everything in Palestine was wonderful, that the Arabs and Jews were getting along famously, and that the economic situation of everyone would improve, when Britain knew that that was not the case. So if I were to try to build a civil case against Britain, I would focus on the fact that Britain knew. It's just like the civil cases being brought against tobacco companies. When one finds the documents to show that they knew 30 years ago that cigarettes can cause cancer, and they kept quiet about it so that they could sell cigarettes. That's precisely what Britain did.
And about immigration itself, it doesn't make Palestinians entitled to reparations. So the fact that Britain facilitated immigration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it would make Palestinians entitled to reparations. Yeah.
Do you think that Palestine needs an ad hoc tribunal, a court for Palestine, like as was the case in Rwanda and Yugoslavia?
I mean, if it can be handled in the International Criminal Court, that is probably preferable. That is, to have a process that everyone understands applies internationally, rather than to have one that is focused on Palestine. But it could be done that way as well. It has been effective to do that with regard to Sierra Leone, for example. But I think it's not very likely that the international community would set up a special court for Palestine. But we now have the Palestine government acceding to the statute of the International Criminal Court, and we have the beginnings of some cases in the International Criminal Court.
Okay. Let's now go to the, let's say, solutions for this prolonged issue. Israel has never missed any chance to disregard international law when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to the prolonged occupation of West Bank, and ignoring the rights of Palestinians. I know that you don't prefer to give suggestions, but if you were born a Palestinian, what would you recommend and suggest to your own government and your own leadership? Would you recommend them and request them to pull out of their commitments like Oslo Agreement, to act unilaterally, or they just employ lawfare, if we can use this term, and go to International Criminal Court, sue Israel wherever possible, cut off the contacts, or you would advise them to continue with the same path?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and I think one has to look at it historically. I mean, going back to 1948, what should have happened was that there should have been a single government for Palestine upon the withdrawal of Britain, just as there was a government for Iraq when Britain withdrew from Iraq. There was a government for Syria when France withdrew from Syria, and they were all under mandates of the League of Nations. But that didn't occur. So the situation on the ground changed, and the international community came to accept Israel, although it was always unclear and still is unclear within what boundaries it accepts Israel. Then you had the 1967 war with Israel taking over the remainder of Palestine's territory. And at that point, or at least by the late 1980s, the Palestine Liberation Organization decided that it couldn't try to claim all of Palestine any longer, and decided to claim only the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And then it agreed to the possibility of negotiations with Israel to lead, in its view, hopefully to a state in the West Bank and Gaza. I was not happy with that agreement, I must say, in 1993. I didn't think it would lead to anything that would be minimally acceptable from the Palestinian side. And I was afraid that the Israeli government would drag out the negotiation process and solidify its control. And that is what has occurred. As to where that leaves the situation now, the choices are even more limited now than they were several decades ago. So there are no really good choices. The possibility of establishing a separate state is, I think, still alive, but it is more difficult than it was because of the widespread construction of settlements by Israel, which has led many people to think it's better to kind of merge with Israel, have one state for everyone, which in a way would be better for the Palestinians, because then you wouldn't have a strictly Jewish state. You would have a state in the whole area that would include everyone. But in terms of getting to either of those ends, I mean, I don't think Israel wants either of those possibilities. At this point, I think Israel wants to maintain control and keep the Palestinians in a subordinated situation. I don't think it wants either to have a separate Palestine state or to merge with Palestine, which leads to the question of how to pressure Israel to come to an accommodation in either one of those modes. And the International Criminal Court, I think, is a source of serious leverage for the Palestinians, and I think it is viewed in that way by the government of Palestine. And it has presented information to the International Criminal Court, in particular about the question of settlements as a war crime, because the perpetration of settlements in territory under belligerent occupation is identified as a war crime under the statute of the International Criminal Court, and as well to take cases to the International Criminal Court relating to the war against Gaza from 2014, and in regard to the recent killings along the armistice line between Gaza and Israel. In fact, in just the last few days, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has issued a statement saying that she is open to considering the possibility of a case against Israeli officials for the killings that have been perpetrated within the last week along that armistice line.
So, proceeding from that, what options do you believe Palestinians have to reach a just solution for this?
Well, I think these various methods of putting pressure on Israel are important, and I'm happy to see that there is some activity on the part of international organizations other than the United Nations. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is going to have a meeting tomorrow here in Istanbul, called by President Erdogan, who is presently the executive officer of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. The Arab League is having a meeting in Cairo to engage in a similar exercise to decide what measures it can take. And I think the mobilization of countries around the world, in effect, to take the place that has been vacated by the United States in the process. I think this conceivably could bring about a minimally acceptable accommodation. That is, Israel can't really stand up against the entirety of the international community. And I think we're beginning to see that. One saw it actually rather symbolically yesterday at the United Nations. After the Security Council meeting, there was a press conference called by the Palestine ambassador, and there was a press conference called by the Israeli ambassador to the Security Council. When the Israeli ambassador spoke, he was standing alone in front of a camera. When the Palestine ambassador spoke, he had with him on either side of him a dozen or so representatives from other governments who were there not speaking, but simply to support what he was saying. And that, at least symbolically, is an indication, I think, of the shift in opinion that has been facilitated as a result of the horror that is felt over the actions of the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza.
Professor John Quigley, thank you so much for your time. It was our pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.